that we understand what the output means, we need to think about what it actually tells us. In the case of a frequency claim, part of the meaning is pretty straightforward since we're describing the levels of a variable. It's helpful to put that in context though. We can do that by thinking about the measure and other research. When we think about the scores in the context of the measure, we can look at the possible range of scores, as well as scales in relation to one another. I'll use the short grit scale file to provide an example of that. We can also think about the scores in the context of the information we discussed in the introduction and literature review. When we're thinking about the meaning in the context of the measure, we need to look at the response options and the way those response options were combined to obtain the scores. In the case of the short grit scale, the responses to the question for each scale were added. There were 4 questions in each scale, and the response options were labeled 1 through 5. So the highest possible score was 20, and the lowest was 4. If someone scored a 20, that would mean they answered very much like me to all of the items. And if they scored a 4, they answered not at all like me to all of the items. We don't always respond in extreme ways though, so we can also think about what the values would be if they generally agreed with the items on the scale were like them, or generally disagreed that it was like them. In this case, that would be 8 or below, or 16 or higher. Then, when we look at the statistics, we can think about them from that perspective. For consistency of interest, the mean of 10.92 indicates that across our sample, participants were generally neutral, possibly trending slightly towards disagreeing regarding how much they behaved this way. Looking at the standard deviation helps us understand that in more detail, though. The standard deviation tells us how far each score was, on average, from the mean. The larger the standard deviation, the wider the variation. There are 2 important details to remember there, though. One is the potential range of scores, in this case 4 to 20. Second, that the standard deviation means variations in either direction. Our short grit scale scores for this sample had a standard deviation of 3.85, so that indicates the responses were generally at the low end of the scale, as 10.92 plus 3.85 still doesn't put the average variation in the high end. Your turn. Pause the video to consider the question in this slide. The perseverance mean is slightly higher, but at 12.6 it's still relatively neutral. The standard deviation is not that much different, but when combined with the mean it suggests there was a little more variation in agreement with the items. 12.6 plus 4 would put someone on the high end, while 12.6 minus 4 would put some at the low end. Looking at the frequency table helps us be more precise in talking about the distribution. In the case of the consistency of interest scale, we said the mean and standard deviation suggests our participants were less likely to say this described their behavior. When we look at the frequency table, we can see that 31% of participants had scores in the low range, and 1 person had a 4, the lowest possible score. In contrast, 12% had scores in the high range. I got that number by adding the valid percentages for the score of 16, 17, 18, and 19, but no one had the highest possible score. Now, again, your turn. Pause this presentation to answer the question in this slide. The score for perseverance shows a slightly different pattern, with 22% scoring 8 or lower, and almost 22% scoring 16 or higher, including 3 who said all items on the scale represented their behavior. That information is more meaningful than just saying the mean was 10.92 and the standard deviation was 3.85. But looking at the numbers in the context of the literature review helps us continue to understand the meaning. The literature review would allow us to understand what the scales mean. In other words, what behaviors or thought patterns are represented by consistency of interest and perseverance. It would also allow us to determine if our results are consistent with other findings. For example, our frequency study might be interested in describing the variable for a particular population, and we consider how this compares to other populations. We can also use findings from other research to anticipate what we would expect about other variables, given our results. For example, research indicates that for some populations, grit scores are strongly and positively correlated with the likelihood of graduating from high school. We might question whether the results suggest a lower likelihood of graduating. Again, though, a caution about the data set and what I'm saying in these slides. The information in these examples is fictional. It was created to provide a teaching tool and should not be used as evidence of anything.